Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am getting back into the swing of recording again after a short break. I recorded one episode before this one with Braxton McCoy, and now I'm here with Evan Meyer, who is known on Twitter as the bicolored python rock snake. And so actually, I think I might have asked you, but what is behind that username? And then, give us a short bio. You've been on before. We talked with John Dios about religion.
Yep.
But for those who didn't catch that episode, what's behind your Twitter handle? And then a quick bio.
Yeah. So the Twitter handle is a reference to one of Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, The Elephant's Child. And if you know the story, the elephant's child gets him or herself, I forget, in trouble, has her nose caught by a crocodile and is getting pulled into the river. And one of the side characters is the bicolored python rock snake, who offers extremely helpful advice couched in extremely obscure jargon and highfalutin words that kind of makes it hilarious contrast. And so that's always been my reminder to myself to try to not speak like that, because that is my my kind of my natural pattern. So it's a little bit of an in joke that way, and it was also in response to my sister, who was her internet presence, and this goes back to blogger days, was as the elephant's child. So I kind of connected it that way.
Oh, that's so sweet.
So yeah, my background, my background, I came to, so background, went to college in the classics. So I'm a humanities guy, Greek and Latin literature, all that fun stuff. Transitioned to the Army and did, the core of that was really interested in languages. So I was an Arabic linguist in the Army for 5 years, got out, wanted to make a transition into kind of the real world of manufacturing and industry. And the best way I found to get to that was focusing in supply chain. So I did my MBA focused in supply chain management. Really was my thought there was, how do I get closest to the nuts and bolts of manufacturing without having an engineering background? And that's worked pretty well for me. So yeah, coming up on 10 years now, working in supply chain management, mostly on the purchasing, sourcing, kind of supplier management piece of things. I've jumped around to a variety of industries. My first job out of grad school was in the defense industry, making missiles and all sorts of fun stuff. And did that for about as long as I could stomach it, and decided I was ready to be done. Switched over, moved back to Wisconsin, to where I grew up, in eastern Wisconsin, for a company making commercial kitchen equipment. So I went from making guided missiles to making soft serve ice cream machines. and and it's funny how those things are the same and how they're different. When we can kind of get into some of those weird aspects of manufacturing. And then most recently I've been in Fort Wayne, Indiana since early in the pandemic. We decided this is where my wife grew up, so decided to come here. At that point, it was a good time to make a move, and I work remotely for a company making outdoor power equipment parts. So won't dox myself any further than that, but
Okay.
it's an exciting industry of lawnmower blades and air filters and oil filters and all that fun stuff.
Oh, that's so funny because Adam, Empty America, one of our favorite tweeters, I think our many of our mutuals' favorite tweeters, was just talking today about how when he was a kid, it used to be that people were outside shoveling snow with just a regular snow shovel. And I don't know, like everybody has snow blowers, and he's like, that's real. Those are like real metal blades. This is real
Oh
energy
yeah.
that costs. So, okay, before we get into that, briefly also, because I want to touch on this at the end of the conversation, you grew up in Africa.
Yes, yeah. So I was born actually in Liberia, West Africa. I was a missionary kid, and yeah, I was there. I was pretty young. We came back. I was 6 when we came back. So my experience is, sort of at that kind of edge of, I have memories. I have, kind of those earliest childhood memories, but also, I don't really have the full third culture experience of
Okay.
feeling like my hometown is a completely different culture too.
Yeah.
That's something that's definitely, I think that would be, if we want to have a really in-depth conversation, we should get my sister on,
Yeah, she's
who's
a little
9 years
older.
older than me,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and really had that core third culture experience of moving back to the U.S. in high school, um,
Yeah.
and all the challenges that come with that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we'll go back to that if we have time after the manufacturing discussion. But so a little bit of background. Well, first of all, I just have to point out that you're just kind of a slouch, huh? You just know all these languages and worked in the army and Arabic and MBA. Only slouches on this podcast, but so okay, the thing is, when I first got on Twitter, I was talking a lot about supply chains, and I'm pretty ignorant about them actually. This is not my uh like I'm not doing any economic analyses of supply chains. I have this very big picture fear that our global economic system is highly complex to the point that there are so many interdependent parts that nobody really has a sense of the whole, and that if some parts of the kind of just in time system, for example, or there's some crunch in energy production that makes energy get really expensive, then all sorts of assumptions about how things will necessarily work with cheap energy can kind of go out the window. I think about this example of, like, I heard it on a podcast once, and you can tell me whether or not it's true, that some manufacturing processes require constant energy. They cannot stop or all the machines will break. Like they need to keep moving through. So like a break in the supply chain so that they can't access that energy at a price that's feasible, or just can't access it at all, then that whole factory could potentially like break the machines in it. So that's the kind of thing I think about when I worry about supply chains. And then there was like, some issues around COVID with shipping, and the shipping got kind of messed up. There's the issues around like chip shortages, which is that's a real thing. But then you often tell me
Hmm.
like this, no, but the system is so much more resilient than you think. And so big picture, let's go big picture, and then let's go detailed analysis of like what yeah, what is it, as somebody who's actually on the inside of that and not just talking out of their ass like I am, what what is actually the case with the
Yeah,
state of supply
yeah. And
chains?
I'd say, yeah, from the big picture, my takeaway about it, of being involved in the nuts and bolts, and I'll say I'm even a step up from the real nuts and bolts. I mean, if you want to get really deep into the weeds of, international logistics and shipping, and like the actual, making the bookings and all of those details, there's some great follows on Twitter that are really, really great commentary on that stuff. Um, but from the big picture, I'd say it is more resilient than it is a huge, complicated, complex machine. But I guess what makes it resilient is that it's not a machine; it's a group of people. And the whole, we talk about the supply chain. You talk about all of these parts that come from different countries, and they go to a third country, and they get assembled, and they get shipped to another place. And yeah, it's super complicated. And the reason it works is because it isn't a machine. It's not something that somebody sets this all up and sets it clicking and whirring and walks away. And I think in terms of risk to the whole thing, as far as there are supply chain tech companies trying to automate things and get more computers into the mix and make things happen more and more automatically, that it's a good thing. It helps reduce cost for sure, but it also does, that does introduce real risk where you have things happening outside of a human looking at them. And that's probably the biggest misconception, I think, is, people look at the supply chain, they look at the products that arrive, from their perspective seamlessly. You order something from Amazon, you go to your local store,
And
it's
it's
on the
easier
shelf,
than
it came
ever.
from
I mean, it's
Peru,
insane. Yeah.
and it seems it's so, the process of it getting there is so opaque to us as consumers that it seems like, okay, this whole complex thing, it could just break. But what makes it resilient is the fact that there's an enormous number of people involved in that process. And it isn't as, as much as a lot of investment goes into technology, there are people every step of the way. I mean, every container ship, I always joke about this, you look at a picture of a huge container ship with 20,000 containers stacked on it. Um, the crazy thing is, every single one of those containers has somebody at a company somewhere who's paying attention to it and who knows it's on the way, who's getting a report about it, who's waiting for it if it's late. There are people at every step of the way, and that's really what makes it. That's what drives the resilience, because it's not a machine that one person built. It's a giant network of independent actors who are putting their own energy and concerns and incentives into finding a solution.
Okay.
And I
But
think that's the hopeful story. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
sorry, go. No, you go. We have a little delay, but go finish up. Yeah, the hopeful part.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the hopeful story of the pandemic and all the changes that happened there. There are some things that I was honestly a little disappointed. I didn't see more innovation in solving some of the weird shortages that came up, and we can go into some of those details. But in general, I mean, we saw containers from Asia increase in price 10x. I mean, from somewhere around $3,000 to cross the Pacific to over 30,000. That's
And
that's a
what happened there?
crazy
Yeah,
change.
what happened there?
And well, I mean, it was related to the that kind of whipsaw effect of the pandemic, that there was just big changes in what kinds of things people were consuming. Some things dropped way off, and then they came back really fast. And so the demand, ships are big and slow, and there's only so many containers. So when the
Right.
demand changes that quickly, it can be really hard. But the interesting thing there to me is, with a 10x increase in the cost of containers, I'm sure somewhere out there were companies that were like, forget it, we can't pay that. But for the most part, like, the cost of shipping is such a small part of the cost of the goods we buy that most companies just absorbed that and said, hey, this can't go on forever. If it does, we'll have to come up, if this continues for a year, we're going to have to come up with another plan.
Yeah.
But they just did in the meantime. And I think that's a sign that, you talk about like the shock of fuel costs or something, which is a very real part of, all the way through. It's a real part of the cost, but it's not going to be one thing that just shuts it down.
Okay. So what I'm hearing, okay, so actually let me back up a little bit and talk for a second from my perspective. So one thing that I worry a lot about, because I've seen it so much in academia and in like not the nonprofit world, is that it actually, this is what I call, as I'm sure you know, spreadsheet brain, which is people really do outsource their worry to a spreadsheet. Like they just put the numbers on the spreadsheet and they sort of say like the spreadsheet will tell us one way or another. So they build these models that, are built on this quantitative data. The other thing with bureaucracy, for example, that I've seen a lot in academia is it's just this sort of hand waving. If something goes wrong, like it's somebody else, so it's some other department's fault, and then that just kind of goes into a circle where nobody really takes responsibility. And it sounds like, so that's part of like my mental model for how things work in complex systems, is that like there's nobody knows what's going on in any other part, and so therefore nobody takes responsibility. But it sounds like you're saying because this isn't bureaucracy, this isn't the public sphere, this is the marketplace. It sounds like you're saying in the marketplace there is like a person who's ultimately responsible,
Mhm.
and that actually makes it more resilient, which kind of like I'm in this process that you're witnessing
Yeah.
of me slowly peeling back all of my ideological priors from college, that like the market is worse than, either the state or like some sort of bureaucratic or NGO apparatus. So is that accurate? Is this the distinction that causes the disconnect?
I mean, I don't think it's as simple as market versus bureaucracy or regulatory sphere. Certainly, shipping and supply chains have plenty of regulatory compliance issues of their own, um, and that's part of things, and some for the good, and some not so not so good. But it is because it is people. It is people who take responsibility. It's millions of people who take responsibility for their you know that they've got to get this box of product from point A to point B, and they're just going to get it done.
Hmm.
And I joke that I joke that it's the fact that everybody thinks supply chains are fragile that makes them resilient. And if people start thinking that they are resilient, then I'm going to get really worried because it's everybody. There's just because nothing. It amazes me even that companies that ship stuff around the world all day long. You think, oh, it's going to be a well-oiled machine. Everybody, everything's just going to work in place. Everything's going to have all the processes done. It's all, maybe that exists somewhere. I have not seen it. It's everybody is fighting fires every day. They're solving problems. They're figuring out workarounds. They're figuring out how to make things happen. Um, and that, because you have that kind of institutional culture of just making it work, figuring out a way to make it happen, all the way through, that's what makes the whole thing function.
Okay. So staying in the big picture for a second, one thing that comes to mind is I'm taking notes because I'm trying to remember these thoughts as they come up. Okay. This is great, and I've never it's never been said on the podcast before, but this kind of aligns with my thinking, or not that I know of, because there's a couple episodes I haven't seen. Don't tell Jason. But this kind of aligns with my thought that human involvement, humans paying attention in complex systems is what actually makes them resilient. It's the same thing on the scale of like land. Once you start
Yep.
putting that, automate it and put it all into a spreadsheet and assume that the same kind of management strategies should happen everywhere, then you have less like resilience to shocks, because you're not able to be adaptable to complex things, which humans are able to do much more than spreadsheets or AI, as far as I know. And then the
Yep.
other, well, there's all these promises of AI, but I'm very skeptical of that. But staying on the big picture, because we like to do doom before we do optimism on this podcast, is okay. So a little bit of backstory. A former guest on the podcast is Chris Mott, who works for the Institute for
Mm.
Peace and Diplomacy. He came and talked about his paper Woke Imperium, but separately, he came to Argentina recently, a couple months ago, and asked if I wanted to attend his talk, where he was talking about international relations basically at an Argentinian university. And we hung out for a day, and we started talking about the multipolar world, the potential for a multipolar world. So that means, not the US or the dollar as the global reserve currency, or the US is like the de facto military power, but instead having like multiple economic and military powers around the world. And in that scenario, he was talking a lot about shipping lanes, and the way they work currently is like de facto US military protects them from basically pirates. And he was
Yep.
saying like, I would be
Yeah.
concerned
Literally
about
pirates.
I would be concerned about pirates in the future. And it was just a very funny but also realistic, because there really are pirates conversation. um
Hmm.
so anyways, I tell that story to ask, what are like your big picture worries about the global supply chain in this potentially maybe multipolar world, or any other, sort of things you see coming down the pike in terms of how the world is evolving.
Yep.
And then we can talk details.
Yep. And that is a real, that I think is a very real concern. I don't want to come across as completely Pollyanna on this stuff, because I think there are very real concerns. I don't think that the scenario of there's going to be some shock to the system and it's going to make it all come crashing down and we're not going to be able to get anything. I don't think that's realistic. What is realistic is either a geopolitical change makes a large region very difficult to get things in and out of. The China East China Sea situation is very real. If we have conflict over Taiwan, like, that's major markets that are within, who's not only the China and Taiwan market, but lots of other goods that would transit that area. So that would be a major disruption for sure. But I think in the bigger picture, what you're talking about, what Chris was talking about there, in terms of a multipolar world, a retrenched America, that, if America decides to take a different turn and say, you know what, it's not our responsibility to police the world's shipping lanes. Every country police your own shipments, control your own, ultimately what that does is it just raises the cost of everything. Certainly there would still be international trade. I mean, there was, that's one of the things. You look back to history and you see how much trade was happening between empires that didn't even know each other existed. They just knew the stuff they got through the trade networks. There's always going to be international trade, but it's a question of, if those structures that make it possible the way it exists now fall apart, particularly on the security front, it adds cost. It adds costs, and it adds and it reduces reliability. So if you don't have the U.S. Navy patrolling the Gulf of Aden and the Straits of Malacca and some of these other pirate hotspots, yes, other countries will also help do some patrolling of their things. Other kinds of arrangements would come about. It wouldn't be a complete free for all, but that's going to add to the expense. So right now, insuring a shipment is a trivial cost. If you look 150 years ago, insurance on cargo was a big part of the cost of cargo. So because the odds of it not getting there were pretty high. And that's just another piece of it. But it really just comes down to that cost. And it just makes everything more expensive.
Okay, so here's when I was talking with Chris, you're probably gonna laugh at this, but here was where my brain went when we were talking about that. So okay, let's just think about like the Taiwan computer chip thing. The logical step, if the world economy starts breaking off into these like multipolar, both military and economic spheres, like imagine there's like I don't know, there already is like kind of trade between these more socialist or communist countries. So like you get like a sphere around the socialist countries, you get these different spheres that are ideologically aligned or geographically aligned. That would, I'm assuming a rational response to that would be to increase local production within your sphere of economic trade, which then could increase cost depending on who's in your sphere. If you have any like low wage production countries within your sphere, like the US can trade with Mexico, so it can still get like the Mexico level of cost. And then the other thing I thought about was more like I don't know how much they're already used, but like internal canals and shipping lanes, like internal to the US, like a whole renaissance, wrath of non-renaissance of cities with canals, because shipping is shipping is so much lower energy cost than like anything else. And then I think trains after that.
Yeah.
And so that was one of my fantasies. And then the other one was not really fantasy, but this is what I was thinking as he was talking. Like mercenary armies that you pay off to protect, like little mercenaries who go along and protect your particular shipping route in your little sphere, who you pay to protect your goods. Anyways, your thoughts on that fantasy that I just made up?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I mean, the mercenary part is one that is already happening on some scales in terms of private security forces being used in some of the worst hotspots. You know, you can get a crew to hop on your ship and brandish their guns over the sides when you transit the Gulf of Aden if you really want, if you're worried about that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's not that
so that's
expensive.
a thing that already happens. um, and the and boy, in terms of the interior shipping, on one level, it's already real. I mean, you look at the amount of tonnage shipped on interior waterways in the United States, and it's enormous. And it's a huge geographic advantage that I think very, very few people recognize that the United States has. That the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and some of the waterways extending off of and connecting those are a huge and very low cost
Oh yeah, and the
avenue for shipping.
constructed water shipping canals that we
Yep.
made over the
And
early industrial
so
revolution.
I think as far as a renaissance for it, I think, it'd be interesting. I think there probably will be increased interest, certainly if energy costs, if fuel costs go up and look like they're staying up. That's kind of the key there is that, those are huge investments for people to make if they assume that any spike in fuel costs is only transitory.
Yeah.
Um, if they, people aren't going to be looking at investing, I don't know, it's going to be tens of billions of dollars for any project like that, right?
Yeah.
For any major waterway construction. Um, but I mean, those are the kind of numbers that could pay off um, if fuels are actually going to stay at a really high level. So, I think that's something that you would see if fuel costs really came up. But in general, I think going back to your first question about the kind of retrenchment of markets and consolidation within kind of more regional things. I think we're already seeing that. You've seen a lot of there's been reshoring. There's certainly been I don't know the ins and outs of the politics. I know there's been some legislation as far as trying to incentivize investment in chip fabs in the United States. I know there's been some movement. I think there's a couple big ones that have announced. Some of the big manufacturers have announced that they're building new fabs in the U.S. and so that kind of thing is. I think it's going to happen. I think it's a natural. It's unfortunately natural that it takes a while for people to really recognize the change.
Yeah.
Working in China sourcing, I'm currently working on a project right now that is mostly sourced in Asia because the type of thing that we're sourcing is you genuinely cannot find it outside of East Asia. Nobody else is making it because it's low cost, very very cost competitive commodity product, and that's just where the whole world gets it. Um, and but 5 years ago, if we were doing this project, there would have been no question that we would have set up a sourcing office in Shanghai or Shenzhen because that's just what you do. When we started this project a year ago, we set up an office in Hong Kong specifically because then our employees there would be able to get visa-free travel to Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, because that's where we're trying to find more of what we can get.
Okay.
We're still ending up a lot in China, but it's for several years now, it's kind of amazed me that it has not been a more mainstream discussion of in sourcing circles to say, hey, maybe we just don't source in China just because there's all these just all these questions about potential future geopolitical risk, whatever.
Right, right.
But yet, maybe we just don't source in China was never on the table. Um, and in the last year, I'm hearing that more and more from people in all, in different kinds of manufacturing. I'm just hearing, so there seems to be a kind of a groundswell change of opinion of like, hey, maybe China's not worth the risk. China's not worth the trouble. And that's been coupled in with other changes in terms of cost structures too. Some of that is wages rising in China to the point where the cost, the wage premium is not as extreme as it used to be. So some of that is going to Vietnam or some of the other places just because of the wage changes as well. But I'm hearing people talk about the geopolitical concern that hey, maybe this just isn't worth the risk.
Yeah, wow, that's
So it's
cool.
interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. And
Things are
yeah,
changing.
yeah, well, and this is always my thing is that I like not that I'm mostly a qualitative researcher, so a lot of the numbers behind a lot of the my beliefs are kind of just, a little bit fuzzy, but in general, I think a lot of people don't think that much in advance about like the possible inevitability or like preparing for potential inevitabilities, like not even saying that it's inevitable that we won't be able to source things in China, but in the case that there's some indication that like they're not going to trade with us at the same level, or they want to have some sort of protectionism, or they want to, whatever direction, that we can't put all our eggs in one basket. And it seems like people are really resistant to thinking that way, just in general. I mean, I guess it would just take, you'd have to do a lot of convincing to make sure that the investment in some alternative would be worthwhile. And the same thing is true, like even thinking about shipping lanes, like people just keep hand waving away like, oh, we'll just have a renewable energy future. But like renewables are primarily, from what I understand, primarily producing electricity. And I know you've said there is like a way to
Mhm.
make liquid fuels at a certain price point from like nuclear power plants or
So
something like
the price point is the key. Yeah.
that. With like widespread, very cheap electric power. But
Right.
like just thinking about like, does anyone wrap their head around the implications of an entire economy running on electricity instead of liquid fuels? Like literally no one is willing to even really discuss that question. Um,
Hmm.
Not that liquid fuels are gonna, I mean, they probably will last a lot longer, maybe longer than I even think, but in terms of accessibility and the price that they're at now. But yeah, it's just like I don't know,
Hmm.
it's really hard to think like about disaster preparedness in general because people kind of want to stick with the status quo, and the status quo goes toward, in my opinion at least, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, like more consolidation, I don't know, sort of more automation, any kind of technological advance. People kind of take it like and assume that it's always going to make things better and more efficient, even if it might not.
Hmm.
And sort of just sticking with status quo relationships. That's not really a question.
Yeah. Well, and I guess on the point about fuels and supply chains, that's one thing that I always come back to is the historical example. Like, we're 150 years ago, even less than that, from the end of the clipper ship era. Like, there was significant international trade with sailing ships, and like, yeah, things, trade was more expensive, but it's we've gotten so used to international shipping being such a tiny cost that like to my point, if a container cost from Asia went up 10x, like maybe eventually if that stuck around, like your cheap flip-flops aren't going to come from China anymore, but like any kind of a high value good, like that's still going to be an insignificant portion of its costs,
Right, right,
to
right.
ship it internationally. So it's like it's not, I mean, even if we imagine a liquid fuel free future, it's not crazy to imagine, I mean, with robotic, if somebody were building a sailing ship from scratch today with, automated controls, that could be crewed by, a dozen people instead of the however many dozens of people that old school ships took.
Hmm.
Um, the people's going to be the big cost driver there. Is just the amount of labor to run the sails.
Yeah, yeah,
but like, we could have our modern supply chain running with sailing ships. Like, no problem. We could do
yeah.
it. Things would take a little bit longer. It would move a little bit slower, but it would still work.
Yeah, yeah, this is totally the kind of innovation I'm down for. All this Luddite plus modern, like, yeah, let's use AI to help like a ship, a sailing ship. That I will accept. But not just like everything highly industrial and then slap an AI on it. Like, oh my God, please no.
Right.
Okay, so while I have you on, can you explain to me the economics of why, for example, we grow peaches in South America and ship them to Asia to package them and then ship them back to the US to eat?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that example is a classic one that you see go around on the memes. And yeah, it looks indefensible on the surface. Um, Ultimately, it comes down to, it's kind of economics 101, kind of comparative advantages. And my guess is that there's a situation there where there's probably my guess is that a situation like that comes about because there's some part of that node that's being artificially cheapened at some level.
Mm.
Um, that there's probably a processing plant in Southeast Asia that is massively over capacity. Some government subsidized the construction of an enormous fruit processing plant and suddenly realized they don't have enough fruit to process,
Mm.
and they're just taking whatever contracts they can get.
Mm.
And so at that point, it's cheap enough to send a shipment of peaches over from Chile to process. Ultimately, what drives that and what makes that possible is just that shipping is just, you know a container is really big.
Yeah.
And when you can ship a 40-foot container for $3,000, like a full container of peaches, the amount of cost per cup of peaches is just, I mean, it's not pennies, it's decimals of pennies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what makes it feasible. And yeah, certainly if we were in a situation where fuel costs increased considerably, or security concerns increased considerably, that those costs were not so negligible, you'd see a lot of that. What looks like nonsensical choices, you'd see a lot of that going away, just because people would have to take a sharper look at how those costs are adding up.
Yep, yep. Okay. One other thing on the supply chains that I've heard you say that I want to get long form. And you said it at the beginning, like sourcing missiles versus sourcing like soft serve ice cream. Um, they're basically kind of like in some ways interchangeable parts. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's something that it comes up in supply chain. You meet people who've been in the industry for a very long time, especially if you're in roles where you're not really close to the product. And I'll say it's something that I've resisted in my career, because I've always tried to stay focused on the product we're making, who's using it, what's it for, are we making a good product? Because that's how I motivate myself. I have to know that I'm making a real thing that somebody's going to use and get value out of. Um, but there you meet a lot of people in supply chain jobs who they are content to just they don't even think about what they're moving. It's just parts. It's widgets.
Yep.
And they have part numbers in their heads, and they can tell you that's a 814692,
Yeah.
and they have no idea what that means, but that's what it is. And this is how many we move every year, and this is where they go from, and this is where they go to.
Yep.
That's not the way I'm wired, but that is a character, a personality you run into a lot. But and that's from that side of it. It is very true. I mean, I joked when I went from making missiles to making ice cream machines, because the bill of materials, the list of parts you buy for each of those things, the bill of materials for the ice cream machine is like more than 10 times as long as for the missile, um, because
It's more
when you buy a
complex.
missile,
That's
when you
why it
build a
always
missile,
breaks
when you
at
build a missile,
McDonald's.
it's an extremely complex piece of equipment.
Mm,
But from the end contractor, I bought 6 subassemblies and the nuts and bolts to put them together with.
hmm
Because it's extremely, whatever the opposite of vertically integrated is, it's the opposite of that. Every major component is, subcontracted to some other part, and that's how, don't get me started on how the aerospace industry is, inefficiently organized. But that's the way it comes out, that you're only buying a handful of parts, and the prime contractor, whose name the general public hears, your Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, they're just bolting things together, and
Yep.
they have the engineering and contracting experience to design.
All right, sorry, we got cut off from a power cut. You were saying from a supply chain standpoint, on the aerospace missile sourcing, and then you got cut off. So continue the end of that statement.
Okay, yeah, I forget how far along I was there. But yeah, sourcing aerospace parts, it's a lot of subcontractor management. You're buying you're buying 6 or 12, major sub assemblies and putting them together, and you're managing all of those, major projects, to make those parts. Versus, some other, when I went to making ice cream machines, we were buying, sheet steel, nuts and bolts, copper tubing, and building that thing from the ground up.
Mm,
So it's a very different set of challenges. I think, honestly, I like the latter better. I think it's more fun, to handle, to manage more of the manufacturing internally, and to not have quite such complex relationships to manage with the subcontractors.
yeah.
Um, but it's just interesting. There's just people outside of manufacturing. You look at it and you think it's all just buying parts and building whatever you build. But even the nature of the relationships you have with your value stream, with your value streams, with your supply chain partners, is very different and very different in different industries.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, one other thing on supply chains before if you have time to talk for a few minutes after the hour. Um,
Yep, I've got
okay,
minutes.
okay, good. Okay. The other thing is I keep saying again, I'm ignorant basically about this topic, but I keep saying like we need an American manufacturing renaissance, and you're just like, there is actually a lot of manufacturing in America. So, can you just set me straight on the record on like what we actually do manufacture still? There's all this like I have this is the thing like with news, national news and like politics that always just makes me feel so alienated is like there's like these stump speeches about like reshoring manufacturing, and then I know of like real Midwestern Rust Belt towns that where the manufacturing actually has left. So I have this sense that it's gone. And so like, yeah, I don't know, just like clarify that picture for me.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of those arguments that gets, it's both sides are true in different ways. So it gets, people can yell past each other pretty easily. So no question, manufacturing as a source of employment, the number of manufacturing jobs has absolutely declined. Yeah, no question there. America continues to build lots of stuff in terms of value. In terms of the value of the stuff we manufacture, we're manufacturing more than ever, and that is a transition that's come as increased automation, more capital equipment going into American factories, so they're producing more stuff with fewer people doing it, and also moving up the complexity or value chain of the type of things being produced.
Mm,
It's really hard to find clothing made in America because clothing is always going to be a high labor content, low low
Complexity.
ability to capitalize
Yeah.
process. So it's going to be extremely expensive to make clothing in the United States.
Yeah.
Um, but if you go into a Chinese factory, a lot of the tooling, capital equipment, the machine, the big plastic injection molding press that's stamping out 1 million flip flops a month is made in America. And
Okay.
so
Okay.
the that's the flip side. So we're making things that people never see, because we're making things that are, you know, if you go to the hospital and you look at the MRI machine, that's probably made in America, but
Hmm.
it doesn't hit you because we're not making as much of the daily consumer goods that most people are interacting with every day.
Yeah.
And for the most part, I'm fine with that. I don't really care if my flip flop is made in the United States, and I'm not, worried about a strategic flip flops gap. But I think there is something to be said in terms of there's something to be said about the worries of, both in terms of employment and the skills of the workforce. That's something that I think is a very real concern for the long term, because just the number of people employed in it and supporting a culture of manufacturing is something that at some level it becomes very hard to support that culture if it's just something that nobody sees, nobody has experience with.
Right.
I grew up in eastern Wisconsin, and I didn't realize until I traveled around the country that it's not normal for there to just be factories everywhere.
Right.
And I didn't realize until I was an adult and moved back to Sheboygan County that we have one of the highest rates of employment, of manufacturing employment in the country.
Mm.
I just thought that was normal.
Right.
And so it is, that transition of the cultural expectations of what work means and what working in a factory means, and what the kind of life you can have working in a factory. Losing that, I think, is a very real risk.
Yeah, and I'm assuming like strategic goods or strategic parts, like the computer chips or things that are like
Yep.
central to. I remember during the pandemic there was some discussion about like, well, we have to source a lot of our medicine is sourced through like one place,
Mm-hmm.
one component of the medicine gets sourced through this one place, and like just thinking about how silly that is. Well, and also like how historically anomalous it is. Like normally, I guess like historically the parallel would be, something like indigo or something you can't get anywhere else except for these few places where it exists. But otherwise, like if it's possible to manufacture strategic goods. I remember there was like an Adderall shortage for a while. Not that I'm like a big Adderall fan. Like everyone should have access to that.
I think that's the limiting supply, but
Yeah,
yeah.
I know. Yeah, exactly. I remember there was some rumors that during the Olympics, all the gymnasts were the American gymnasts. The I think it was the Olympics in Russia. Adderall is a controlled substance. The Olympians weren't allowed to bring their Adderall with to compete, and like a lot of the American gymnasts and American athletes were like struggling and doing really poorly relative to how they normally do because they couldn't get access to their Adderall. And I was just like, this is God's will. not even so religious, but I was laughing at that. But no, okay. But in general, like life-saving pharmaceuticals, important like components to cars, or goods that people use every day.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a place. It's one of those things. Like, yeah, there's definitely a risk on the other side, that government doesn't have the greatest track record in what they define as a
Right.
strategic commodity. Uh, the we still subsidize sugar cane in Florida because there might be a war and we wouldn't be able to buy sugar from the Caribbean, and so we have to grow our own sugar cane. It's like there's always that the official on paper reason for the sugar subsidy is for war production.
Okay.
Um, so there's always going to be that, and but again, there's always going to be that. So I think there is a place for targeting some of those genuinely strategic industries and saying, hey, maybe there's a place to, like, because industry has, I am a free marketer in general, and I think mostly if people have healthy incentives, they'll make good choices. Um, but I think we've seen risk be probably underpriced in a lot of people's calculations.
Yep.
So situations where and again that's comes down to business culture of saying, well, this is where everybody buys their chips. I'm not gonna pay more for a chip from somewhere else just
Yep.
because it might be a little bit safer or give me a little bit more reliability if there's a conflict. Because people like, and you hear this when people make these decisions. They'll say, well, all of our competitors get it there too. So if there's a war, we're all going to be in the same boat. So we might as well just get it there.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I hear that expressed commonly. So it's like, my thought is, well, we spend a little bit more and then you have this enormous advantage over all your competitors if something happens. Like,
Yeah.
wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah.
But I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. There's also this thing that now that we were talking about this, like it seems like there's this, I think it might be like I don't know if it's couched somehow in like liberal or progressive ideology, but the idea that like there's no real like moral, like I don't even know, there's no distinction to be able to tell what is like necessary, a necessary product from not. Like it just, there just seems to be this flattening of like everything that's on the market is equally good. Like no one could make an assessment like that, like maybe blood pressure medication or something that's like actually life-saving is completely equal to like antidepressants. And I know I'm going to anger people by saying this, but like, just, or like flip-flops, or like, I don't know,
Mhm.
stupid consumer goods that are completely unnecessary. There's like this weird sense that it's very hard to make value judgments about like strategic goods.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say outside of actual military planning kind of things where the government is going to say, we have to step in to make sure we have some production, at minimum in a friendly country. Um, I think there's maybe a place for that. Outside of that, this is where I am going to just be a textbook free marketer and say, nobody can be in a position of placing those kind of value judgments on things other than the person saying, I'm willing to pay more for the thing that matters more.
Right, right, right.
That price mechanism is what's going to drive, you know, is what's going to have to drive that difference. And it would work, if you come into a situation where there is shortage, where there is, allocation of resources, the people shipping blood pressure medication are going to be willing to pay a lot more than the people shipping flip flops,
Yeah,
and that allocation.
yeah. Although to push back a little bit, there are subsidies on things like commodities and like and weird
Yep.
incentives on things like, like just how pharmaceuticals work in general, and the insurance companies and the random prices they put on things, and like basically government enforced insurance, you know what I mean? So there's like these things where it's like, the insurance companies are just going to make as much money as they possibly can, and they're not really going to prioritize saving somebody's life versus getting somebody their SSRIs or whatever, because there's weird incentives there. But I in general I get what you're saying, like, the but yeah, anyways, it'll play out how it plays out. This is the whole doomer optimism thing. Anything else on
Yep.
manufacturing that we didn't touch on that we had discussed privately or on the timeline about things that should be clarified that I have missed
Yeah, I guess.
about?
Yeah, I just wanted, I would just jump in on the flip side. I've been very much a global supply chain defender in this hour. I will say, in my personal life and my personal consumption, I think there is a lot of value in building local economic community. And so, as much as I'm willing to defend the existence of global supply chains, I also think there's enormous value in being economically connected to to your neighbors, and in having local production that connects you to your neighbors. I think global supply chains are great for feeding everybody, for producing tons of raw calories and making sure they get to where they need to be. Um, and I don't want that safety net to go away. But at the same time, I am, you know, I think on some level it goes beyond, it goes outside of the spreadsheet brain. It's not just a matter of calculation, that there's something really fundamental, when it comes to food, about producing for each other, um, and supporting each other in community, that I think is goes beyond anything that you can really calculate as an economic optimization problem.
Okay, okay.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I'll just throw that out there. So I am a localism believer, in terms of building community and building
Yeah, this
interdependence,
is okay, so this is
even
good.
if I'm happy.
Yes.
To
Okay, so this is actually good. And let's leave the Liberia discussion till when we can get your sister on, because I think it will be good to have a like a just let that be a super in-depth discussion on its own. But this is good because something I've been thinking a lot about lately is like I've been wavering between the, return trad, go back to the way things once were, to, as opposed to the techno optimists who lean like heavily into just get rid of all former ways of doing things and lean as far into every innovation as possible. Instead, thinking about a synthesis of the two. And it's really interesting, and maybe you can talk a little bit about why you're convinced to do this, but why you're convinced to have land and be a localism respecter,
Mhm.
because there's like this, there's a place for high and low. There's a place for like high tech. I mean, I'm thinking about the sailing ship run by AI. Like there's a place for high tech, but then you cannot let that erase all low tech skills, craft skills.
Mhm.
Like you were talking about, like the culture of manufacturing, the culture of what it's
Mhm.
like to build something, and the meaning behind that. And I think about like highly complex globalized supply chains seem to work super well in conjunction with super close, super local supply chains. Like what a cool, okay, yeah, let's get this complex, super high tech stuff from around the world and let the global capitalist system make that thing happen. And then like the most base level, safe water, safe food, connection to neighbors, ability to produce, ability, the skills to produce things, showing kids how to do hard work. Like it seems like a nice juxtaposition, and you're convincing me that I can start to respect the global supply chain a little bit more, and maybe me and Adam can be friends on that topic. So anyways, let's hear your what. Yeah, do you agree with this like synthesis
Yeah,
idea?
absolutely. I think there's so many ways that, um, especially, development of technology, the internet has reinvigorated some of these, kind of traditional ways of life, traditional home production. So much of kind of what we think of like 20th century big, centralized production, marketing, distribution, that is solving a communication problem ultimately, because producers can't meet consumers in a way that, that lets them both meet their needs. The internet, really solves that problem in a lot of realms. It's not perfect yet. I know that every few months, it's like I feel like there's a discussion about somebody crowdsourcing a new app to help support farmers market producers, or something along those lines. But those are moving in the right direction. I mean, every highway roads, back road, vegetable stand, somebody's just got, a party tent set up on the side of the road, selling off their excess, zucchinis and tomatoes. And it used to be they would have a box, bolted to the ground or whatever,
Yeah.
or just a basket with loose change, pure honor system. And that still works, in a lot of places. But I've seen ones where they just have a poster with a Venmo address on it too.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's it's like, you look at that synthesis that makes, you have the whole global economy, technological infrastructure, and it's supporting selling off excess tomatoes on the side of the road. Um, so I think we are seeing the way, that development, we're seeing those systems, those tools being used to support a way of life that people are choosing for its own benefits, not
Yeah.
for, you know sometimes you get into these arguments. It's like, oh, you're just a larper because you're not actually a subsist, you're not actually
Yeah.
growing all your own food for subsistence, and you're not totally supporting your family on the produce from your own land. And you're like, well, that's not the point. It's like we bought, so out of this background, we recently, a year and a half ago, we bought 34 acres outside of town, that we're hopefully, at some point going to build a house on. We're actually right now, hopefully, if everything works out, we'll be buying the neighbor's house, the neighbor to the land. So we'll be able to live out there.
And
And this
tell
year
me,
we
like, what
started some.
motivates that? Like, what? Yeah, why for a global supply
This
chain
year we started
perspective?
selling vegetables to family and friends. We've just been, and we've sold more than I expected for our first year. Actually, officially in commercial sales. My wife just sends a weekly email out to a bunch of friends and says, "Hey, this is what we have available. These are the prices," and coordinates a pickup. And again, it's not about that becoming our major source of income for our family. It's about, mostly for me, it's about, I really enjoy gardening, and it's a way to defray the expense of that.
Mm.
Um, and it's a way of, the number one priority for me is raising my children in a culture of production, in a culture of being useful, and a culture of, using your skills to make things for your community,
Hmm.
that they conveniently give you money for, which is nice.
Hmm.
And that, like, but just that mindset that, I joke, you talk about the synthesis between the techno optimism and the homesteaders. I've had a jokey post that my wife does not appreciate. That I joke that the children of the homesteaders will be the best Mars colonists. Um,
It's true though.
and she does not appreciate that, because that is not her dream for them, for sure. Um, but yeah, it's about creating a culture and raising kids in an environment where they have, that deep well of skills and resilience, um, and adventure and curiosity, and all those things that translates to success. In, people look at, like, oh, your kid's not obsessed with TikTok, how are they ever gonna, adapt to the future of
Yeah,
technology? I'm like,
yeah,
when they become adults, TikTok won't be around anymore. And like,
yeah.
how do you, where would I be if I had just gotten obsessed with whatever technology was at when I was 12? Like,
Right, right.
it's building, it's about building, a more generalist set of skills and curiosity, and ability to adapt, more so than immersing in any particular technology.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? It's so funny because that's such a good like doomer optimist tagline. I can never really like put my finger on who I'm like attracted to for the podcast. It's just like, I don't know, people who are trying things, and like, what do you mean by that? It a perfect tagline would be like future recruits to the Mars colony, but none of us would take the money, or none of us would go. But like the kind of people who they would want to recruit to go to get them set up, people with skills in high and low, people who are resilient,
Mhm.
people who can think on their feet, and people who have like agency despite whatever challenges they're facing. But like, yeah, people who also know how to like manipulate the actual world as it is, not just like, I mean, all the people who want to go to Mars are like, the ones I can think of are like the like video game players. Like they like literally have no on, they're like, basement dwellers. Like that would be a load to bring to Mars. Like you would have to be a real frontier person. And I'm writing an article for Unheard about this. To be a real frontier person, you have to have skills. You have to uh be resilient, be able to bounce back from challenges. So I love that. Let's end with that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? Now that you've got the doomer optimism spotlight for a second.
No, nothing in particular.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. This has been a lot.
Yeah, super fun. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we finally got this on the books, because we were always chatting about these topics, but so different to get it down long form. So okay, I will let you go. This has been long enough recording time. I need to go outside and get some fresh air and go pick up my kids from school. But Evan, you have a great one, and thanks again.
All right, thanks, Ashley. Take
All right.
care.